So not too long ago, it was announced that Resident Evil 4 is being remade, and since Capcom did alright remaking Resident Evil 2 and 3, you might think this seems like a perfectly logical next step. If you're a cretin! The original Resident Evil 2 and 3 absolutely benefited from a remake, because they had been clunky, fixed-camera PS1-era survival horror games from the era of graphics when everything looked like the contents of a pork butcher's waste paper basket. Resident Evil 2 could finally realise its full potential by being brought up to date and remade as a third-person over-the-shoulder action survival horror in accordance with the current standard for Resident Evil games, that is to say, like Resident Evil 4, in which case it should be obvious why Resident Evil 4 itself wouldn't garner quite the same benefit. Maybe I'm too nostalgic for the original RE4, but it was a lightning strike that can't possibly happen twice. It was a total ground-up reinvention of the franchise that was also a landmark in the history of gaming generally, pioneering both advanced graphics and the over-the-shoulder style of third-person shooting that dominates the genre to this day. And if you pluck that game out of all of that context and just make it utterly homogenous to the established style of the Resident Evil remake series, the inevitable end result is mediocrity. I can tell, even from the one flimsy trailer, that they're sanding down RE4's over-the-top edges so it can fall more in line with the generally understated, more realistic tone of the RE2 make. Can you honestly picture the Leon S. Kennedy from the RE2 make somersaulting through a second-story plate glass window for literally no reason, except that it's quicker than taking the stairs, or suplexing a monk into a concrete step so hard that their head explodes? I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, because this is exactly what one should expect from where we currently are in the Resident Evil cycle. And yes, Resident Evil, like history, Sonic the Hedgehog and a middle-aged dad for the first week of the new year, has a cycle. It's gotten much more noticeable now we've gone through it a full 3 times. There's some variance in the specifics, but the main points are always covered. It makes one good game, then proceeds to very lengthily fuck everything up as it chases its own tail. So it all started with Resident Evil 1, which a lot of people liked, and is remembered as a classic, but it always left me cold. I think that's because I came to it a bit after the fact, and it's one of those games whose classic status largely hinges on it being the first. Well, okay, Alone in the Dark was technically the first fixed-camera survival horror 3D characters on a 2D backdrop game set in a haunted house, but Resident Evil was the first one of those that didn't really suck, that balanced horror and action with an arguably intentional air of amusing B-movie camp. You remember how I hypothesized that everyone forgot about Prey 2017 because it didn't have enough rough edges? Well, Resident Evil 1 was nothing but rough edges, and people loved it. Personally, I always rated Silent Hill 1 higher, but that came out later, so that's hardly fair. Resident Evil 2 followed and was received more or less equally as well, but after that the energy seemed to go out of Resident Evil. A curious pattern emerged, in that every new Resident Evil game that followed just randomly picked a main character from the first or second game, and then put them through the same bloody motions as always. Survival horror adventure in enclosed, monster-filled environment, then find a secret lab and defeat the main baddie after they turn into a giant wall of snot. That was the case with Resident Evil 3 and Resident Evil Code Veronica, and I suppose also Resident Evil Gaiden, but no one would blame you for forgetting that one. And because all these samey experiences were in the same continuity, the established canon timeline of Resident Evil became a ridiculous, bloated mess of secret schemes and conspiracies until the amount the Umbrella Corporation was getting away with absolutely defied even the smallest amount of sense or verisimilitude. Suddenly it was less knowing B-movie campness and more dull-witted escalationism that only emphasized how badly written it had always been. After that, with interest dwindling, Resident Evil burrowed its nose even further up its own arse and started with the remakes and prequels. Resident Evil 1 was remade, and Resident Evil 0 told the never-before-seen story of a main character from the first game having a survival horror adventure before fighting a giant wall of snot in a lab. Neither game was particularly disliked, but they didn't set the world alight either, and even if they had, the execrable Resident Evil Dead Aim would have pissed it out again. Lastly, the franchise spat up Resident Evil Outbreak, which went down about as well as any suddenly multiplayer-focused installment of a single-player franchise, like an ovarian cyst in a handful of popcorn. So that might well have been it for Resident Evil, if it weren't for a little game called Resident Evil 4, which wasn't just a step up, it was a total protonic reversal of fortune. It completely dispensed with the established gameplay systems and rebuilt itself from the ground up, and with the exception of the protagonist being Leon from RE2 again, it disentangled itself from the previous canon and told a whole new self-contained story about the president's daughter being kidnapped by weirdo Spaniards. The end result balanced horror, action, and hilarious B-movie campness so well that it was just as much a ground-shaking revelation as the original. But it turned out this was just the second iteration of the cycle, and as before, a great initial game swiftly gave way to a prolonged downward spiral. It was like Capcom immediately immediately unlearned their lesson to innovate and reinvent rather than chase its own trend. And so Resident Evil 5 just rehashed the gameplay of 4 while simultaneously miring itself back in the ridiculously garbled stew of canon that 4 had so effectively escaped from, personified by the reappearance of Chris Redfield, protagonist of RE1 and character absolutely not worth hanging on to. He was just generic G.I. Joe hero man. Leon had a bit more of a spark to him. He was a wide-eyed rookie cop with insecurities about his masculinity, who in RE4 graduated fittingly into a sort of insecure person's idea of an action hero. Chris Redfield was, is, and shall always be a big lump of wood, and in every game post-RE1 his appearance is a bigger omen of doom than a 666 birthmark. The second cycle of Resident Evil was hastened to a close in part by Resident Evil 6, a brown-trousered absolute mess of a game, born of the misguided attitude that a sequel should just be more of the same but bigger and with more stakes, resulting in an even more garbled and ridiculous stew of plot lines, bringing back every motherfucker who'd ever been within earshot of an RE story, as well as an unwanted co-op multiplayer focus. The cycle is curiously consistent in that the appearance of multiplayer-focused games is always one of the final death knells, and you can't get much more final than Umbrella Corps, the Resident Evil-themed multiplayer tactical shooter and horrifying blight upon God's domain. That was definitely the new low, so after that, little wonder that the only recourse was to start the cycle anew, and lo and behold, Resident Evil 7. Really good game, check. Total overhaul of established gameplay, check. B-movie campness, check. Self-contained plot unrelated to previous games, check, mostly. Almost immediate downward spiral, double check, and mate. In fact, the downward spiral was starting before the first game in the cycle was even finished, as Chris Redfield shows up at the very end to immediately start tying everything back to the fucking Umbrella Corporation. It seems each time we go through it, the cycle accelerates. So this time we only had time for one sequel, RE Village, that rehashed the good game while also bringing back tangled mess plotting and being generally all over the place before the nose plunged anuswards for the RE2, 3 and 4 makes. And we've already had the last gasp desperate multiplayer-focused game with Resident Evil Resistance. At the current rate of acceleration, I estimate that next we're going to go through the whole cycle in one game. A game that starts really good, and then Chris Redfield shows up halfway through and the final boss is multiplayer only. The wacky thing is, if Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 4 had been new IPs, if they'd been respectively called Evil Residence 1 and Captain Floppy Hair's European Vacation, they would have been just as good and probably just as successful. Tying them to the Resident Evil series garnered no benefit, except to allow the infection to keep spreading and assure the cycle continued. Well, I say break the cycle, so end the franchise, yards. Like you said to do with Silent Hill as well. Is that your solution to everything? Well, you know, overlong horror franchises, horses with broken legs, people who cough too loud on the bus. You'd be surprised how often execution is the best way forward.